My fellow Americans, Supreme Allied Commander General MacArthur and Allied representatives on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The thoughts and hopes of all America, indeed of all the civilized world, are centered tonight on the battleship Missouri. There, on that small piece of American soil, anchored in Tokyo Harbor, the Japanese have just officially laid down their arms. They have signed terms of unconditional surrender. 4 years ago, the thoughts and fears of the whole civilized world were centered on another piece of American soil, Pearl Harbor. The mighty threat to civilization which began there is now laid at rest. It was a long road to Tokyo and a bloody one. We shall not forget Pearl Harbor. The Japanese militarists will not forget the USS Missouri. The evil done by the Japanese warlords can never be repaired or forgotten. But their power to destroy and kill has been taken from them. Their armies, and what is left of their navy, are now impotent. To all of us, there comes first a sense of gratitude to Almighty God, who sustained us and our allies in the dark days of grave danger, who made us to grow from weakness into the strongest fighting force in history, and who has now seen us overcome the forces of tyranny that sought to destroy his civilization. God grant that in our pride of this hour, we may not forget the hard tasks that are still before us, that we may approach these with the same courage, zeal, and patience with which we faced the trials and problems of the past 4 years. Our first thoughts, of course, thoughts of gratefulness and deep obligation, go out to those of our loved ones who have been killed or maimed in this terrible war. On land and sea and in the air, American men and women have given their lives so that this day of ultimate victory might come and assure the survival of a civilized world. No victory can make good their loss. We think of those whom death in this war has hurt, taking from them fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, and sisters whom they loved. No victory can bring back the faces they long to see. Only the knowledge that the victory which these sacrifices have made possible will be wisely used can give them any comfort. It is our responsibility, ours, the living, to see to it that this victory shall be a monument worthy of the dead who died to win it. All millions of men and women in our armed forces and merchant marine, all over the world, who, after years of sacrifice and hardship and peril, have been spared by providence from harm. We think of all the men and women and children who, during these years, have carried on at home in lonesomeness and anxiety and fear. Our thoughts go out to the millions of American workers and businessmen, to our farmers and miners, to all those who have built up this country's fighting strength and who have shipped to our allies the means to resist and overcome the enemy. Our thoughts go out to our civil servants and to the thousands of Americans who, at personal sacrifice, have come to serve in our government during these trying years, to the members of the Selective Service Boards and Ration Boards, to the civilian defense and Red Cross workers, to the men and women in the USO and in the entertainment world, to all those who have helped in this cooperative struggle to preserve liberty and decency in the world. We think of our departed gallant leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt, defender of democracy, architect of world peace and cooperation. And our thoughts go out to our gallant allies in this war, to those who resisted the invaders, to those who were not strong enough to hold out, but who, nevertheless, kept the fires of resistance alive within the souls of their people, to those who stood up against great odds and held the line until the United Nations together were able to supply the arms and the men with which to overcome the forces of evil. This is a victory of more than arms alone. This is a victory of liberty over tyranny. From our war plants rolled the tanks and planes which blasted their way to the heart of our enemies. From our shipyards sprang the ships which bridged all the oceans of the world for our weapons and supplies. From our farms came the food and fiber for our armies and navies and for our allies in all the corners of the earth. From our mines and factories came the raw materials and the finished products which gave us the equipment to overcome our enemies. But back of it all were the will and spirit and determination of a free people who know what freedom is and who know that it is worth whatever price they had to pay to preserve it. It was the spirit of liberty which gave us our armed strength and which made our men invincible in battle. We now know that that spirit of liberty, the freedom of the individual, and the personal dignity of man are the strongest and toughest and most enduring forces in all the world. And so on VJ Day, we take renewed faith and pride in our own way of life. We have had our day of rejoicing over this victory. We have had our day of prayer and devotion. Now let us set aside VJ Day as one of renewed consecration to the principles which have made us the strongest nation on earth and which, in this war, we have striven so mightily to preserve. Those principles provide the faith, the hope, and the opportunity which help men to improve themselves and their lot. Liberty does not make all men perfect, nor all society secure, but it has provided more solid progress and happiness and decency for more people than any other philosophy of government in history. And this day has shown again that it provides the greatest strength and the greatest power which man has ever reached. We know that under it we can meet the hard problems of peace which have come upon us. A free people with free allies who can develop an atomic bomb can use the same skill and energy and determination to overcome all the difficulties ahead. Victory always has its burdens and its responsibilities as well as its rejoicing. But we face the future and all its dangers with great confidence and great hope. America can build for itself a future of employment and security. Together with the United Nations, it can build a world of peace founded on justice, fair dealing, and tolerance. As President of the United States, I proclaim Sunday, September the 2nd, 1945, to be VJ Day, the day of the formal surrender of Japan. It is not yet the day for the formal proclamation of the end of the war, nor of the cessation of hostilities. But it is a day which we Americans shall always remember as a day of retribution, as we remember that other day, the day of infamy. From this day we move forward. We move toward a new era of security at home. With the other United Nations, we move toward a new and better world of cooperation, of peace, and international goodwill. God's help has brought us to this day of victory. With His help, we will attain that peace and prosperity for ourselves and all the world in the years ahead.
Thank you, late President Truman, for that wonderful victory speech, reminding us that coming up in a matter of days will be 75th anniversary of VJ Day. A day where surely there will not be, you won't see many parades in the streets, you won't see many memorials. Well, you'll probably see a few memorials out there, but a day that by and large will largely be overlooked by so many other things that are going on right now in the world. So, but a very, very significant milestone that we're coming up on as we conclude the 75th anniversary of World War II. And last year we just concluded the 100th anniversary of World War I. So we live in a period of time where an awful lot of anniversaries are coming our way. Unfortunately, we're also living in a time where those are easily forgotten and overlooked. But here we sit, here we stand, and I want to welcome everybody. I have my viewer counts hidden, but I did see a follow come in the middle of that. Neon Leon, appreciate it, buddy. Appreciate the follow. Welcome everybody to another Havoc on Air lecture session with the kid. This will probably be, oh no, this one won't be. This will be my next to last probably session where it's just me. Starting, I believe, with the atomic age, there will actually be two of us that will be involved in these presentations. I'll have one of my buddies who will also be joining us. He'll either be here through Discord, or if the situation allows, we might even have him right here with us. So that'll be a fun one. Also, real quick, some housekeeping stuff. Coming in October, we will be doing a haunted history series, which is going to be really fun. I'll shoot out a reminder again at the end of the stream. Haunted history will be a little bit fun. I'm doing one that makes me really uncomfortable and one that I love talking about. Normally, every year around this time, I'm asked to give tours of a haunted mansion that we have on installation. This year, that's not going to happen because of COVID. So I have condensed that tour into a presentation that I can give to everybody here on Twitch and on Facebook and on the website and everywhere. So Haunted Mansion stuff will be great. Also, Diatov Pass will be in there. That one makes me really freaked out. I still twitch a little bit every time I bring that up. But today we're going to wrap up our World War II 75th commemoration series. This presentation was originally given on 11 August. Sorry. It was originally given on 11 August for local libraries here in town. As we tend to do, we tend to give these lectures for work to local libraries for a number of general reasons. General public gets to come in, school-age children, college students. We give it to everybody pretty much. However, we've converted this into a wonderful platform for Twitch. That is the wrong date and time that is down there in the corner. I understand that. The original presentation was supposed to be last week. Did not happen because we had Superstorm Derecho that decided to rip through the state, and that made things a little bit difficult for us to give a presentation in a timely fashion. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. This will be on VOD. I believe it's 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. So if you're not joining us right here immediately, won't get a chance to ask any questions, but you can certainly shoot us a message on Facebook, shoot us a message here, send me an email through the site, whatever makes you happy. So we're going to dive right into this as we conclude things with World War II here. Just to reorient everybody with the timeline of World War II. Again, this is kind of all over the place, and this is explicitly the Pacific Theater. You could argue that this is the U.S. timeline for World War II. It's not true. It's very not true, in fact. But some people would argue that it's the combative timeline for World War II, and even that's mostly incorrect. But we'll let it go for now. Mostly today, we're going to be focusing on in this Phase 4 period here. And just to give you a little bit of a zoom in on that, Phase 4 is specified by West Point as during the later stages of the war, the Army Air Force, operating from the Mariana Islands and flying the B-29 Superfortress, had begun to firebomb the cities of Japan. These raids culminated and precluded the dropping of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima on 6 August 1945 and Nagasaki on 9 August 1945, which we're going to talk about both today. Japan surrendered to the Allies on 2 September 1945. So I scheduled this so we could have it close enough to an anniversary. We did the first presentations, just after 9 August. We're doing this one just before the 2 September anniversary, so we're trying the best that we can here with what we got. So to give you a bit of an orientation here, here's our Pacific situation in 1944 and 1945. We're primarily going to be focusing almost entirely, as far as operations go, in the Western Pacific. As far as homeland operations, of course, we'll be dealing with things in the United States. Actually, a lot of this will be dealing with things in the United States. So just kind of bear with us on that. There are a couple of things that I've been wanting to point out here, just because now that we've got this, we've got a stream, we've got a larger reach and everything, I want to make sure that I'm including in everybody that I possibly can. So, situated over there on your right side, you'll see that there's Joint Nat Route North and Joint Nat Route South. Joint Nat Route South included a large contingency of Mexican forces. So the Mexican forces were helping us with transit. And Joint Nat Route North also included Canadian forces as well. And then, of course, we had influx support from Anzac forces, Australia, and New Zealand as well. The darker shaded areas there, that's pockets of resistance that don't necessarily mesh with where I've set up the alignment. So if it's on one side of the red line, a darker shaded space means that there's pockets of Allied resistance. If it's on the other side of the red line, it means there's pockets of Japanese resistance. The lines are not entirely uniform. So take those areas with a little bit of a grain of salt. I tried to be as upfront as I could possibly be with it, but just kind of keep that in mind if you're looking at this as a point of reference. These are, of course, our operations. We're going to be focusing today mainly on a few of them here, the ones that are on the Japanese mainland. So we're going to be looking at Downfall, which includes Olympic, Coronet, and Majestic. And then Meeting House we're going to cover briefly, and then the two centerboard operations are going to be a big deal. There is a reason that I'm not bringing up Ketsugo, and the reason that I'm not going to be talking about Ketsugo is because we don't know anything about it. The information that we have on Ketsugo was basically saying, yeah, the Japanese are ready to roll when Downfall happens, and that's all we know. So that makes it a little bit difficult for us to deal with, especially from the fact that the Japanese burned everything that they had at the end of the war to try and cover everything up. So we don't have a lot of information on Ketsugo. So I'm going to preempt that question by saying I don't know if that question comes up. As far as installations go, the last presentation, you folks probably remember if you saw it, this map was full. It's still kind of full, but it's really not when you think about it. We're primarily going to be focusing on the Ryukyu Islands, so that's Okinawa, the Volcano Islands, Iwo Jima, and the Marianas Islands, particularly Tinian. So we have airfields all over the place here, but we're only going to be focusing mainly on 3 island groups, and within those 3 island groups, 1 airfield apiece, pretty much. Now, something else, though, to bring up is that these aren't the only airfields that we're going to be talking about. There's 2 other locations that we're going to want to take a look at. The first being Boeing Omaha, and the second one being the Alamo Gordo Range in New Mexico. So, let's see. Let's keep going here. I've got a little auto shutdown thing in my microphone, and it keeps coming on because there's no audio feedback except my own voice on here. So periodically I have to pause. So I apologize for that. Let's take a look at things in the U.S. and what's the big deal with the U.S. at this point. Well, we talked last presentation about how the U.S. has implemented the use of atomic weapons. And of course, we pretty much front-loaded here that we're going to be talking about the atomic bombing of Japan. But how do we get to the atomic bomb? Well, for that, you're going to have to look at these 22 strategic locations in North America, mostly in the United States. Some of them, 2 operations in Canada. Most of those are majority U.S. staffed. There's a couple of Canadian officers and a couple of Canadian staff that are in those locations. Most of them are American, though. But there's 22 locations, and the reason that I wanted to make sure that I threw this slide up is to emphasize that it wasn't just Los Alamos, it wasn't just Alamo Gordo, it wasn't just any of these locations. It was in fact a large assortment of a large assortment of locations that actually were involved with the atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project, the Trinity program. So as you can see, pretty much ranges all the way from Berkeley, California, all the way up to Chalk River, Ontario, Washington, D.C., of course, the Pentagon's there at the time, Rochester, New York, down towards Alabama. So there's tons and tons of locations that are actually involved with this project, including three of them are in Iowa. Well, I guess Omaha, Nebraska, but there's actually quite a bit of them that are actually in the Midwest. So that always kind of shocks people when I throw that in there. Is like, yeah, there was actually a lot of atomic programs that were actually ongoing here. No way, man. Well, yeah, actually there were. The big ones, of course, were Project Ames, and then there was also the Rock Island Arsenal, and then the Glenn L. Martin plant, or Boeing Omaha, as we called it on the previous slide. But the big ones are going to be the Alamo Gordo, New Mexico site, which is Project Trinity, Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is Project Y, and the Glenn L. Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska. Those are going to be the big ones. But if we're going to look at things with the Manhattan Project, we're going to have to go to Germany. And I know I don't want to go to Germany in 1938, Nazi Germany, icky world, but here we are. And I'm going to preface this by saying I am not a chemist, I am not a mathematician, I am not a physicist. If you ask me, if you push me on any of these questions, I'm just going to sit here and go, because I really don't. I got no idea on some of this stuff. I'm a historian. I know history stuff. I know that this guy over here in the right corner is Albert Einstein, who's getting his U.S. citizenship in 1940. He had previously written a plea to actually President Roosevelt, saying that the Americans need to fund research into the atomic bomb. They have to beat the Nazis, because Einstein recognizes how absolutely urgent the need is for the Allies to have the weapon, because he knows how terrible the Nazis are, and he knows what the Nazis will do with an atomic bomb if they have it. But well before this, we already know that radiation is a thing. We already know that there's a potential for atomic research and development and exploitation and all of that. So as early as the 1930s, we're seeing that research kind of pick up. But also at the same time is that there's an influx of scientists that are fleeing Germany, mainly because they see what's on the horizon. And Einstein is one of these. He flees in 1933. By 1939, the lines get cut. There's no way for anybody else pretty much to flee Germany, and what scientists are left there, they're either going to have to be smuggled out, sneak out, or kind of just submit. So by 1939, pretty much that ends, but the foundations had been laid for the Manhattan Project by that time in the United States. They're already beginning to have think tanks. There's a lot of brainstorming that's going on, and indeed by 1940-41, we have a proto-Manhattan Project established already in Berkeley, California. So most of the scientists that were going to flee had already done so by the time that the gauntlet comes down. The greatest turnover actually happened in about 1930, 31, 32. Einstein comes out of Germany at the end of that kind of exodus. And a lot of the scientists, in fact, that come out of Germany actually go back and invest in the Manhattan Project for the United States. So it's actually kind of interesting when you see the roster roll off the list, just how many of them are actually immigrants that came over from Germany at the time. So the U.S., as I mentioned, they opt to build this bomb. In 1942, we have firmly established that there is going to be what we call a Manhattan District. The Manhattan District is going to basically be all over the place, but we're kind of keeping it secret exactly what the function is at the time, of course, for obvious reasons. But the interests that are going around here at the time mean that there needs to be some kind of multinational cooperation. So basically that means there has to be some kind of give and take with this program, because we're going to need a lot of expertise. And the primary provider of such support actually comes from the United Kingdom. But another big thing too with all this is that we recognize it's going to be a big project, it's going to be a costly project, it's going to require a lot of people, it's going to require a lot of brain power, it's going to require a lot of things. And rather than, we're already kicking out so much money when it comes to things like war material, so ships, we're sending out ships left and right. I did a presentation earlier on the Battle of the Atlantic, and we talked about how much tonnage we had lost in the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was absolutely insane. The U.S. is having to pay to supplement the losses that it's dealing with in the Battle of the Atlantic. Resupplying and retrofitting the Navy, it's having to train up millions of soldiers. So it's having to cope with a lot of cost, and it's also having to cope with a lot of material production constraints. So rather than building brand new facilities at all these different locations that would be, in our current mindset of today, convenient, what is instead decided upon is that we would use pre-existing locations that excelled at certain things in order to reduce cost, increase security, and keep expertise where it's best found, I guess you could say. So we really kind of used a give and take kind of thing with all this. So Los Alamos and Alamogordo were chosen due to their isolation. Those were largely just because we didn't want the Russians involved. We didn't want the Germans involved either, but it was more so the Russians, the Soviets, that we were worried about at this time, especially as you get in towards 1944-45. Not quite as worried about the Germans as much as we are with the Soviets at that time. But that does not mean that we were successful in keeping the Soviets away, and indeed there was plenty of espionage that ended up happening. So the key points here would be Hanford Engineer Works in Richland, Washington. They were responsible for nuclear materiel production. They actually had the reactors in Richland, Washington. So the core material that was used for the Trinity project actually came from Richland, Washington. Of course, Los Alamos, New Mexico had Project Y. Those were the main research laboratories for weapon design. Alamogordo, New Mexico, I love that name, was where Project Trinity was, Base Camp Trinity. That's also where the weapons were actually tested. The Glen L. Martin plant is where the production plant for the B-29 Silver Plate bombers came from. Those were exclusively used for the Manhattan Project. And then lastly, Rock Island, Illinois, Rock Island Arsenal, was responsible for manufacturing the weapon chassis and casings for the, I think it was for the Fat Man bomb. They also made some key components for inside too, but their big claim here was that they actually built the chassis for the bomb. So the overall organization and structure here, really the Manhattan Project really took on the image of what any program would have looked like. I mean, I understand how some of you might sit out here and look at this. Some of you may not necessarily be militarily inclined. You might not know certain things with how structure works, but this basically looks like a standard organization chart. You wouldn't know just by looking at this that you're looking at something that's, has to do with atomic research and development. So they actually had designed this to make it seem as though you were dealing with just another research and development branch. There was nothing revealing about it. There were plenty of civilians that were involved with it, which made it look even less intimidating to somebody who might have stumbled across it. However, if you know anything, from the Cold War forward, you know that if there's a civilian involved, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's lighthearted by any means. We know, of course, now that civilians are in almost every nook and cranny of military weapons design, development, research and development, and things like that. So it doesn't mean the same thing now, but generally from World War I and World War II, civilian involvement at this level was not uncommon, but it kind of demeaned things if you were a spy. Generally, you would have more security or more heavy involvement here. To anybody who was looking in, this would probably just look like a regular army outpost or something like that. It wouldn't look particularly intimidating. Of note, we'll go around to some of these key sites that I highlighted on the previous slide. And the first one, of course, is the Los Alamos site. Los Alamos is still used today. It's the largest national laboratory that's still in operation. 80% of it is now currently operated by a private contractor. It's not operated by the federal government, or at least 80% of the facility is not operated by the federal government. But that doesn't mean some crazy shit doesn't still go down there. And I was not going to query too hard into it because I really don't need that to come up on a background check for me ever. I'm good without that one. But it was initially selected, like I said, for its isolation from private eyes. Project WISE was the initial incarnation of the laboratory, and if I'm remembering how the laboratories were laid out, I believe those dark beige buildings right there in the middle are actually the original buildings, and possibly the two white ones on the lower right side of that picture on the upper left. So it's just grown since it was established. There were ancillary buildings as well further out, so this picture is not all of the laboratory now, and it wasn't all of the laboratory then. But it was a good picture anyway, and I took it. It was widespread over a large area. Again, it had that same component. If you didn't have everything huddled together, it made for a really crappy espionage target. Doesn't mean that it worked all the time, but it made things more difficult. And as I said, it remains in operation today. Over on the right side there, you can see Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, who was the chief of the Los Alamos site. He was presented with the Army-Navy E Award in 1943. Anybody who knows anything about atomic research and development should know Dr. Oppenheimer, because he was the one that had immediately said, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, after seeing the Trinity blast in 1945 in the White Sands Desert. So Mr. Oppenheimer, I keep going at Mr. Oppenheimer, but Dr. Oppenheimer, unfortunately later in his career, will come up on charges of potential treason and spying. He'll come up on a few charges of being a Soviet sympathizer or a potential communist. And if memory serves me right, he does not retire in the United States. He actually ends up fleeing at some point. And it was found that he was not at all guilty of any of those things. But however, he was a victim of the Red Scare, unfortunately, and McCarthyism. So I wrote a paper on him, I think, in my second year of undergrad. And I was just kind of flabbergasted by how it was that we treated a man that gave us so much and helped us win a war, and then we turn around and forced him to flee to a South American country, if I remember right, which is where everybody flees apparently in World War II. Anyway, that is the Trinity site. at the lower left corner. Trinity was kind of an unfortunate thing. We think of Trinity all the time as the Trinity explosion, the bomb, but there was actually a base camp. It was at the edge of the Alamogordo bombing range, which the U.S. had owned since 1942. And one of the most unfortunate stories about this poor installation, it's kind of funny actually if you look back on it, is that since it was in the bombing range and it was a classified installation, you would have U.S. Army and U.S. Navy bombers that would be flying over on mission targets. And there was, unfortunately, one or two occasions where markers for bomb deployment dropped and then they went out. And the bombers kept flying and they saw the lights at Base Camp Trinity, and they had assumed that Base Camp Trinity was their target because it was the only light anywhere in this desert. Thinking that it was the flares, they bombed Trinity site, their own site with people in it, and they destroy, if I remember right, a stable and a mess hall. So it was bombed twice. So one of the side effects of having classified space in your territory in a bombing range. But that eventually, after 1945, it becomes a non-issue. The site was closed at the end of 1945. 1953, it gets reestablished as a National Heritage Site. You can go there today, actually. It's literally, none of the buildings are there anymore. It's in the White Sands Missile and Test Range today, but it is actually marked off. There's like a circle of lights and then just a rock, an obelisk in the center of the road, kind of, and it says, yep, this is Trinity site. And I think there's also now a Fat Man chassis there. I'd have to look into that. Now I'm questioning myself. Anyway, it's a great, if you like rocks in the middle of nowhere, I mean, this is your site. I'm not going to be a travel agent for Trinity. Sorry. Moving on to actual Trinity. Anyway, 16 July 1945. As my buddy Bob said, it was the first artificial sunrise of 1945. And it will not be the last artificial sunrise of 1945. There will be two, but it started with a conventional test on 7 May. There was 100 tons of TNT that they packed into a kind of a container, stacked all the packages on top of each other, and blew it up on top of the tower, just to see if the tower would actually survive it. It didn't. I'm not entirely sure why we were testing to see if the tower would survive a 100-ton explosion, especially if we knew that the bomb that we were working on was going to produce thousands of tons worth of yield, but I guess reasons. The final revisions actually come after this test, and we had debated at this juncture whether or not we were going to use the bomb on Japanese cities, or if we were going to have delegations from the Japanese government and military actually come and witness an explosion in a test range. It was decided that we weren't going to do this because what if there was a malfunction? The Japanese might be able to get some kind of an insight as to what kind of destruction it might yield, and it could be a waste of a bomb. Plus, it wouldn't have the same kind of psychological impact. So they scrapped that idea. They also took Kyoto off the list, as we'll get to here in a bit. But that idea was pretty much scrapped. Trinity was detonated shortly before sunrise on 16 July 1945 at an altitude of 100 feet. On that tower, like I said, it produced about 22 kilotons of TNT as a yield, and they did have B-29s that were present as observation aircraft. Now I have to go back because previously I had mentioned that the 509th Composite Group was the only one that was involved with the B-29s that had anything to do with the Trinity test. For observation, that wasn't true. Observation, I believe, was carried out by the 216th Reconnaissance Team, and 206. I know they were 200 something, but I think it was 216th. But they were also flying silver plate B-29, so they were actually configured and ready to handle atomic devices at that time. But the first bomb was massive in size. It was called the Gadget. That is actually the Gadget. That is the bomb that is exploding in the upper right-hand corner, but it's shown down there at the left. Um, it weighed about 10,000 pounds. The thing was huge. Same components as the Fat Man bomb. The only reason it was a Sapphire is because it was a simple design. It was finally armed at 2200 hours, so 10 o'clock Mountain Time, on 15 July 1945. In preparation for the detonation that came that following morning. So, as I mentioned, the B-29s, we had to have a way to actually deliver these 10,000-pound bombs, which is ridiculous weight. I don't think Moabs even weigh that much these days. But the first B-29 prototypes flew in 1942. That's them down there in the lower left corner. Those are actually the YB-29 prototypes in olive drab even. Most B-29s did not have the olive drab. Most of them were actually silver, so that's a rare photograph there. But they are actually hand-selected by Colonel Tibbets off the assembly line in Omaha. He actually goes to Omaha and he hand-selects, I can't remember if it's like 10, 12, or something like that. It was a very small number of B-29s. He hand-selected. He actually went up into each one of these and selects each one of them to be refitted into what's called Block 26, which we know as Silver Plate or Saddle Tree B-29s. And eventually, those are used as the platform for the B-50 update that follows in 1948. I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole other fiasco that I really don't want to touch. There's actually a lot of controversy. If you ever feel like really throwing your head into a wall, go look up the B-36 and the B-50 and the bomber gap. And then you're going to put death threats on me because I told you to look that up when I'm really not telling you to look that up, and you're going to be asking me why. So I disclaim that right now. Don't look those things up if you value your sanity. Anyway, so the big thing here was that they removed a lot of the guns. They upgraded the engines. They reinforced the actual body of the aircraft, and they actually made the wings a little bit thicker on the Block 26 updates. There were a total of 82 that got produced with the B-29 designation before they go to the B-50 designation. I think there were 84 of those. And these stay in service all the way up through about 1960. So they actually will stay in service for quite a long time. By about 1949, definitely by 1952, we'll see all of them moved out of the bombing mission. All of them will be moved over to reconnaissance by 1952 because we have the advent of the jet bombers in the B-52 bomber. So Fat Man and Little Boy, of course, are the big key players here because those are the bombs that will be delivered to Japan on August 6 and August 9. So Fat Man was the device that was dropped on Nagasaki. It's also the one that Rock Island Arsenal produced, and it was the first production variant of an atomic device. There were about 120 of them were produced between 1945 and 1949. They were finally retired in 1950 when we had smaller devices that were able to be fitted on smaller chassis. They were also much lighter. I think the next bomb that comes after this weighed about 5,300 pounds, and then the one that came after that was about 3,000 pounds, if I'm remembering right. So there was quite a difference in weight between all the different types of bombs and devices. Those are the ones that Rock Island Arsenal made, like I said. That location was chosen because it had a history of large output, and it also had a history of handling secret U.S.-British collaborations. An example of that is the Mark 8 tank. The Mark 8 tank was the first American-built tank, if anybody was wondering about that. They were completed in 1919 and 1920, and they were, for lack of a better term, they were just a giant coffin that kind of crept along the ground, and They had machine guns on the side, and it was a great thing. It went a whole 3 miles per hour. Yeah, you were really well protected in one of those things. I'm working with work to try and get a hold of one. I don't know how that's going now with COVID. Anyway, Little Boy was the one that got dropped in Hiroshima, and then it did get retroactively produced. There were 25 that ended up being produced, but none of them were ever equipped with atomic material. That was because the U.S. Navy had decided by the time that they had gone back to produce them that they could get a hold of the new atomic bombs that were cheaper, lighter, easier to carry. Didn't need them. But the big reason that they had to be retroactively produced is because the schematics and designs were actually destroyed for Little Boy. So it took another extra 3 years for them to go back and actually find and develop Little Boy again. But again, by the time that was all said and done, there was no reason for it anymore, and the U.S. Navy decided to move on. Now at this time also, let's start coming away a little bit from the research and development. Let's get back into the war. So Japan is on the defensive at this time. They've been forced largely into a state of retreat. I'm going to have you inverse those colors there on the side. Red is actually the US. White is actually showing you where the Japanese are. They're just heavy losses mounting. The Navy and their air power is absolutely dwindling. There was no surrender policy in place because of the Bushido Code that they were following at the time. The Imperial Japanese were just very adamant that surrender was not an option. However, within the Japanese government, by about late 1944, we start to see signs, at least in retrospect, that the emperor is starting to waver. He is getting really weary about whether or not he wants to continue the war or if he wants to opt for some kind of negotiation. And by June of 1945, territorial islands began to be invaded by the Americans, so that's the Ryukyu chain that I was mentioning earlier. And the Japanese home islands by this time, because of the B-29s operating out of Tinian, and then, well, no, it's actually largely Tinian. They're actually got most of Honshu, Kyushu, most of those islands are now within striking range. So the Japanese home islands are still getting battered by American firebombing. Japan had keyed in on 4 terms of surrender by July of 1945. Generally, this was to absolve Hirohito and absolving a lot of war crimes and international prosecution. There's a few different sources on that. I left that in there, but there's some arguments that say no, the Japanese really weren't that worried about war criminal prosecution. However, the evidence of that lies in how they handled the destruction of documents related with Unit 731. If anybody goes and researches Unit 731, I will tell you right now that is highly sensitive stuff. If you are squeamish, if you trigger easy, if anything like that, definitely be careful when you research that. It's some gruesome stuff. It'll make you think kind of what happened at Auschwitz. So it's very sensitive. But at the same time, there's internal power struggles that are happening in Japan. There's people who ally themselves with the emperor. There's people who ally themselves with shogunate legacies. But the thing of it is that there's firebombing that's going on that's destroying entire cities at this time. So entire cities are being wiped off the map, let alone the atomic bombs that are going to come later, but entire cities are being destroyed now. And we haven't even gotten to August yet. So there was also a big thing, too, where we're now recognizing that the citizenry was not necessarily... They were loyal to the emperor, but they weren't dedicated to the war. And the reason that we say that is because we know that the Japanese citizens idolized the emperor. We know that. What we are now discovering, though, is that there are tons of post-war lawsuits. So originally, I think I had quoted like 4 or 5. There were a lot more than that that actually come out in the 1950s, 60s, 70s of Japanese citizens that were alive during World War II or members of their family that are actually suing the Japanese government for not entering negotiating stages earlier. So there was definitely some resentment in the Japanese population. So there's some key planning that goes into this. So there's requirements that have to be met for an atomic bomb target. It has to be more than 3 miles in diameter. It has to be a major city with a manufacturing capability. The blast would have to create effective damage in the target area. And the target needed to not be on the list of target selection prior to the month of August 1945. And lastly, and most importantly perhaps, must have some sort of lasting impression by way of culture, strategic, military, or production to create psychological trauma. For all intents and purposes, this was designed to be a psychological strike. It wasn't meant to be totally, well, no, that's not true. It wasn't meant to be physically destructive as it was to be psychologically destructive. So that brings up a total of 5 targets that they're looking at. The first one is Hiroshima. Second one is Kokura, which actually later on becomes, or what it's now known today as Kitakyushu. Niigata, Yokohama, and Kyoto. Interesting thing about Yokohama, there's plenty of U.S. activity that goes on today in Yokohama. However, Kyoto, as I mentioned, Kyoto is special. We know that Kyoto is a cultural center today, as it says on there. It's an intellectual center. It has major cultural significance in history. So before any kind of planning goes out for Kyoto, it's struck from the list and is replaced with Nagasaki. The first target is to be struck no sooner than 3 August 1945. And as I mentioned, Kyoto is struck from that list on 30 May. And Nagasaki is added to the list on 25 July. So they actually operate with 4 targets up until the end of July. So we have to look at Tinian now. So Tinian, this is an old slide too. This is from the first slide that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and playing all these in here. So Tinian was, we had established a base on Tinian. It was a massive base that was capable of launching up to 250 some B-29s off of it. It put all of southern Japan in range. It was also put Okinawa in range and all the Ryukyu Islands. So it was a key strategic launching point. And it also made the B-29s much more effective in their bombing ranges as well. But basically, the Americans will take Tinian, and as soon as they take Tinian, they've got Corps of Engineer guys following behind them, running with hammers and shit, and they're basically hammering all this stuff in the ground. And they're building things pretty much as they're taking the island. So that is why by the time you get Americans take Tinian on 24 July 1944, I think by 1 February 1945 we have bombers already taking off out of Tinian. So it's an interesting situation with Tinian. But unfortunately, Tinian, North Field at Tinian was not kept up. So the Americans have taken Okinawa, and that's where the Americans are going to operate out of for the Cold War. It's where they're going to operate out of today. We still operate out of Okinawa for air superiority exercises and things like that in Asia. The airfield that's used now on Tinian is actually the original airfield. It's actually Ushi Point Airfield. That is the one that is still used today. So Tinian that's actually a picture of Tinian down there in the lower left corner. It's sad. So on the eve of destruction, the United States has already decided, yep, we're going to go ahead with this, but we want to make sure that we've conveyed to the Japanese citizens, you need to get out. There's major destruction coming. So they've been dropping these leaflets that basically list out individual cities and are telling people to flee, but they also say that we cannot promise that only these cities will be among those that are attacked. There's broadcasts that are being pushed into Japan that are saying, hey, citizens need to, you need to come out and say that, this war needs to end. And there's a growing amount of psychological trauma that's starting to culminate within Japan at this time because of this. So a lot of the citizen population largely is just done with this by this point. So that's part of the reason why potentially that so many people actually do leave the cities when these leaflets are dropped. So I want to put that out there. By and large, American leaflets that were dropped on cities did what they were intending to do. They got people out of the cities by and large. That doesn't mean that they saved everybody by any means, but a lot of people did flee cities because of this. Now, in the middle of Potsdam, there's agreements that, the U.S. is going to notify the U.K. and Canada if there's deployment of an atomic device. There cannot be a non-military strike of atomic weapons. But the other thing that was, of course, agreed upon was the Soviet involvement of the Pacific Theater War. And that's one of the key components that is going to push Japan as well. So while the American nuclear war is one of the reasons that Japan is going to come to the negotiation table, the Soviet invasion is going to be another piece of that. It's kind of like that 1-2 punch thing that we've been getting all year in 2020. But there's these unilateral agreements of Soviet involvement in the war by September, and Truman is very insistent that it needs to be September that the Soviets go in, because Truman actually will hint to Stalin at Potsdam that we have a powerful new weapon. Of course, Stalin already knows pretty much what that weapon is. He's got eyes and ears all over the place down in Los Alamos and New Mexico, all over the place. But Truman is thinking that he's keeping his cards close to his chest, when in fact the Soviets have pretty much found us out by this point. So the two carriers here, of course, Enola Gay and Boxcar, as I said in the last presentation, they are just one in a fleet that were actually involved in the deployment of the bombs. That is Enola Gay there on the left. On the right, that's Boxcar. Boxcar is the one that delivers the bomb to Nagasaki. Enola Gay is the one that delivers to Hiroshima. And both of those bomb blasters are down there on the side. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because I beat it to death on the last presentation, but these were the two saddle tree bombers that were involved in the bombing. So these are our three primary targets. So Hiroshima, the Aoi Bridge is going to be the primary target in Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, it's going to be the industrial center. Kokura, as I mentioned, is actually the original target on 9 August, but we'll see that it's not possible to carry out that bombing mission. But we'll get to that here in just a second. So on 6 August 1945, the crew of the Enola Gay had been training with test bombs. They were called pumpkin bombs, up to 5 August. And pumpkin bombs were basically fat man bombs with no atomic device in them. They were basically just heavily loaded with TNT and just, it's a bomb blast. Now, the early radar in Japan does detect bombers shortly after midnight on 6 August 1945. There were multiple bombers that traveled in separate routes. Most of them had converged on a different location. So basically, there was an all-clear sounded in Hiroshima by shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning. Enola Gay, Great Artiste, and Necessary Evil will actually rendezvous at Iwo Jima prior to the bomb run. Straight Flush has already made its way to Japan. It's way ahead of the rest of the crew, and it's just after 6 o'clock in the morning. It calls clear weather in Hiroshima. When Straight Flush flies over, air raid sirens go off again. 7 o'clock, as I mentioned, all clear goes again, and the bomb release occurs on schedule at 8:15. Little to no harassment by the Japanese. It detonates 44 seconds later. After release, 800 feet over the Shima Surgical Clinic, and the blast yield was about 16 kilotons. Now, the reason that it had drifted slightly is because of wind. There really isn't a lot that could be done with it, just because, I think I mentioned this before, bomb sights are just not that accurate at this time. So even a slight drift is still considered a hit. It wasn't too terribly off the mark when you're considering World War II era targeting. So this is the intended route, and this is the route that Enola Gay will take to Hiroshima, egressing from the target area, and then returning. So that's the target area right there. That's Hiroshima. And Kokura is the first alternate target, and Nagasaki is the second alternative target that they're going to look at. They don't have to look at either one of those because the bomb goes off without a hitch in Nagasaki. At 5:55, it rendezvous over Iwo Jima. At 0609, as I mentioned, Straight Flush calls weather as all clear. 0809, final bomb run begins. 8:15, it's released from 31,000 feet, and at 8:17, that's when Enola Gay will actually feel the shockwave from the bomb for the first time at altitude. And then they'll egress back through to the international zone and make their way back to Tinian after flying out over the bay. So 7 and 8 August. A lot of people might say that it might have been quiet. It certainly wasn't. Truman actually had announced the use of the atomic bomb by this time and issued a warning to Japan saying, hey, we've got it. We can do it again. We can do it as many times as we need to in order to stop this thing. Now, at the same time, the Soviets have decided, well, shit, if they're going to get involved with this, then we better get moving too. So they will actually unilaterally launch strikes against the Japanese in Manchuria on the mainland. And at just after 4 a.m. in the morning on 9 August, Tokyo received word that the Soviets have declared war on Japan. So there's that 1-2 punch I was mentioning. And Japan was convinced, though, that there was only 1 or 2 bombs and that they were going to just wait it out. Just wait it out. Well, we know that they're going to drop another one. And if they do, oh well. That was kind of the Japanese military plan. So you can kind of imagine why the Japanese public was kind of pissed off about that. American crews continued to drop leaflets. They were saying, push on the emperor. You need to get out of cities. But by 7 August, the decision was made to go ahead and carry out that second strike on 9 August, and the third bomb had actually entered the planning phases by this time as well. So on 9 August, the crew of Boxcar had been training up to 8 August, but there was a bit of an interesting thing with Boxcar. There were some discrepancies in the experience that the crew had with other members in the 509th Composite Group. So Boxcar was flown. It was the one that actually delivered the bomb, but it was actually piloted by crew from the Great Artiste that had flown the Nagasaki mission. And instead, the crew of the Boxcar was flying the aircraft Great Artiste. So they just kind of traded things around there. But it's confusing for a lot of people who just assume, well, it was the Boxcar crew. Well, no, it wasn't. It was actually Great Artiste crew flying a different bomber. The aircraft had technical difficulties. I mentioned that in the previous presentation, that technical difficulties, there was a spare that was involved. However, they decided to push on with carrying out the strike package anyway. They were originally going to move on 11 August, but there was bad weather coming, so they pushed it up to the 9th. But the problem is that delays with technical difficulties had pushed the intended bomb period back far enough that winds had started to pick up in the area, clouds had started to pick up in the area, and because the winds had picked up, um, previous bombing runs in Yahata had actually led to poor visibility over the target area in Kokura. So by about 9 o'clock in the morning, the Kokura mission is scrapped, and they decide that they're going to proceed to the secondary target of Nagasaki. But even when they get to Nagasaki, they're going to have to enter a holding pattern, and they do so for almost an hour and a half before there's a last-minute break in the clouds at 11, and that it actually allows them to drop the bomb. Now, they should be flying back to Tinian. They're not going to make it back to Tinian. This is the one mission where there's just enough wrong for things to get a little bit tense. So this is the route that Boxcar ends up taking. And you see it winds up, it's actually pointing at the wrong island. It should be pointing at the other larger island further down there. For Okinawa, it's actually going to land back on Okinawa. Again, there's a rendezvous point at 6:32 in the morning. They're going to enter this holding pattern over Kokura at 8:04. By 9:14, they take the option for the secondary, and they're going to strike at Nagasaki, but they enter a holding pattern again shortly after 10 a.m. 10:53, they decide they're going to try and do a manual run so they can do an immediate abort if they need to. But at 11:01, that last-minute break lets them actually release the bomb with a last-minute break in the clouds. And that's where you'll finally get the shockwave. The bomb blasts at 20, I think it was about 21 kilotons, if memory serves me right. And they'll egress, making an emergency landing at FABE Okinawa. And the reason that they have to make the emergency landing is because they actually will lose 2 engines in the process. There's actually accounts of one of the crew who say that if we had missed our first pass on Okinawa, we would end up in the water because there was no way for us to go back and make a second pass. So we were very close to losing Boxcar on this mission. If they had missed their pass, Boxcar would have been lost, and that would have been the only B-29 loss that we would have had on an atomic mission. The rest of the bombers, however, they're going to make their way back to Tinian, and they'll egress, and things will go relatively normal for them. So Japan finally does surrender on 15 August 1945, but before that, there is a message that will go out to U.S. Army Air Forces in the Pacific Theater, and this is actually that actual message here over on the side. The next bomb of the implosion type has been scheduled to be ready for delivery on the target on the first good weather after 24 August 1945. We have gained 4 days in manufacture and expect to ship from New Mexico on 12 or 13 August. The final components providing there are no unforeseen difficulties in manufacture and transportation to the theater or the arrival thereafter. Bomb should be ready for delivery on the first suitable weather after 17 or 18 August. Now that was signed by Major Groves, but General Marshall actually will come back and say that it is not to be released without express authority from the president. So by this time, we have the idea that the Japanese have broken. We have this idea, we know that they're talking. They've entered, actually, the table by about 13 August. So by 15 August, everything's going to be pretty much taken off the table for any kind of strikes on the Japanese. They were still uncertain of surrendering on 9 August, I have in there. There is an attempted coup that happens. Actually, I think it was on the night of 14 August, if memory serves me right, just before the golden record on 15 August. Japan formally surrenders via broadcast by Hirohito. Absolutely, Sam. Thank you so much for the follow. I'm glad that you enjoy history. We will have a few more of these as well. So, but yeah, fantastic. I love it. Just in case any of you are not familiar with the golden record, Hirohito basically says that this is ad-libbed. An American came up with this translation, so I don't know exactly how accurate it is, but it's pretty close and true to form. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects, or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. And basically, what Hirohito is doing here is he recognizes exactly the determination of the Americans, and he knows the determination of his own people. So it's a big deal. If anybody wants to look up Operation Downfall out there, Downfall is a fantastic example of why we have absolutely, we know for a fact just how devastating World War II could have been when it comes to casualties in the Pacific theater. We can talk all day about how severe and significant the European theater was, but we know now that if both sides had pulled the trigger in 1945 in the Pacific theater, it had the potential, at very realistic potential, to dwarf European theater casualties in number. So it was definitely something significant, and I'll get to that on the next slide here too. But following Hirohito's declaration, Allied occupation begins on 28 August, so look at the date here, tomorrow. Actually, I guess it would have been now. I think it's 28 August in Japan. And the formal surrender follows on 2 September. And of course, we heard President Truman's declaration of VJ Day on 2 September at the beginning of the stream. So anybody can go back and listen to that part of it. It took place under the supervision of General Sutherland aboard the USS Missouri. Many high-ranking officials continued to surrender despite the ceremony, and as we know, there were plenty of holdouts that continued well after the Japanese surrender on 2 September. And when I say well after, we're talking years after. Germany, Soviet Union, Cold War, the First World Wars. So I'm glad to hear that, Sam. I'm very glad to hear that, because we will be talking Cold War stuff, absolutely. I'll just give you, and I'll give everybody here a little bit of background. My graduate degree is in Cold War military history, so we'll be seeing a lot more Cold War stuff as we go on. The next 2 presentations will be Cold War. I'll give you guys a heads up on that here in just a few minutes. But yeah, Cold War stuff, I've got you covered, buddy. I definitely do. So I mentioned things with Downfall here, and I do want to mention Downfall because it's worth bringing up. It needs to be brought up. It needs to be addressed. So we're talking about the atomic bombs. We're talking about the end of hostilities. But what if we didn't use the bomb? That's always been one of the key questions that a lot of historians, military historians, like to ask. And I'll make this a little bit personal for you folks. My 3rd year of undergrad, I had an instructor who was a lieutenant colonel, and lieutenant colonel gives us a question that says, I want you to explain the ethics. Would you have dropped the bomb, or would you have not? And I was kind of flabbergasted at that. So what I argued what I had kind of, assumed was the answer he was looking for, and the answer that I thought he was looking for is no. I know that now was the incorrect answer. He also told me it was the incorrect answer, but I know now that it was the incorrect answer, because I did not know then what I know now about Downfall. And Downfall was a culmination of land, sea, and air force, of which the world has never, and hopefully will never see. It included 42 aircraft carriers across 4 fleets, 5 air forces, plus a British auxiliary force, not to mention the Soviets that are operating in the northern theaters and in Manchuria. It also had operated on the suggestion that there were 2,500 aircraft in the Air Force. There were actually 10,000 in the Japanese Air Force. That was a huge reconnaissance error. And it authorized up to 7 additional nuclear strikes on the tactical level. Now, as we get into Cold War, that's actually something that I've written about before on the Havoc website. We'll be doing a presentation on it again. We'll be talking about tactical nuclear warfare applied to frontline theater combat operations. But this would have been the first example of such a thing. So the Allied command had assessed over 4 million IJF warfighters plus 31 million civilians. And because of Bushido, it recognized all 31 million as combatants. So the total combatant engagement totals were estimated to be over 40 million, with casualty rate of over 30% projected across all combatants by the end of 1946. The operational planning was canceled effective 15 August 1945, thank God, because it would have been absolutely insane to deal with that kind of casualty rate. Some projections had up to 12 million casualties by the end of 1947, and it did not include the Soviet numbers. So this was an absolutely just devastating thought. And indeed, these figures come from both sides of the pond. This is not an American figure. This is not an explicitly Japanese figure. This is not just a Soviet figure. This is an agreed upon figure across all 3 involved parties here. So it's staggering to think about, especially today when we think of combat operations where you see 100 people that have lost their lives in combat. We talk about this a lot. You'll see a situation where we've lost 100 combat troops, 200 combat troops, up to 1,000. When we're looking at things like World War II and we're seeing 25, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, a million casualties lost over a battle. So it's staggering. So post-combat operations, and I'll get to you here in a second, Sam. Post-combat operations here, so we'll take a look at 1942 through 1952. Tokyo finally starts to get rebuilt around 1952. That's why I think I put that number there. Occupation of former Japanese territories continues through about 1974. Okinawa was the last holding that ended up getting turned back over to Japan. In the middle of all this, Japan actually comes to the Americans and asks the Americans to stay in Japan. And you'll see things like Kadena Air Force Base as an example of that. Kadena today is, I think, one of the largest American-Japanese joint operated installations that operates in the Pacific Theater, and it's also one of the key strategic points for all combat operations in it's not PACOM anymore, it's Indo-PACOM. But Kadena grows out of this agreement that comes out of World War II. The Korean War will highlight strategic importance of Japan actually in guaranteing stability in the Pacific Theater. Unfortunately, that just doesn't translate well when we get to Vietnam. That's not Japan's fault, though. I don't want to put that on them. But again, as I mentioned, those holdouts continue well into the 1970s. So that's actually a picture of Lieutenant Onoda and Private Nakamura down there. And these are holdouts. 1974 for both of them. That's crazy to me. It's crazy to me to think that somebody from the 1940s, where there were no jet aircraft, there were no rockets, there were rockets, but not really used in theater, and somehow you are still in this mindset that you are engaged with the same enemy. Put it like this to you folks, these 2 individuals here down on the lower right corner were in combat when Zeros and F-4U Corsairs were still flying. in the skies. And they're still holding out when we have SR-71 Blackbirds and F-4 Phantoms and F-14 Tomcats flying around with aircraft carriers all over the place. So it's something that's just kind of amazing to me. But World War II by the numbers. So as we do come to the end of hostilities here, the total loss. Casualties, I want to emphasize, casualties are not deaths. Casualties are KIA, MIA, wounded, anything like that. So total losses, we have about 60 million. It's more than that. A lot of the numbers out of the Soviet Union are kind of fudged, and we have no idea exactly how many of those figures out of Japan include Unit 731 figures. And the same is true for China, too. We have no idea how many of those are Unit 731 figures. But when you look at the total loss of 60 million, upwards of 61 million, and you look at the amount of resources committed, which is over 84 million, that's a hell of a loss ratio. It's mind-numbing for a number of different reasons. So you're looking at, what is that, 1, 2, 3, that's 3/4 of your total commitment that is lost. And I know that some of that's civilians, that you see lost, but that is still just a staggering figure, an amazing loss of life. And you have to think to yourself, thank God that we are on the other side of that. Hopefully we can learn from it. Hopefully we don't go towards a 3. I know World War III is a punchline word these days, but hopefully we don't go towards that. That concludes this part of the presentation. Let me catch up with you here, Sam. So let's see, 4 questions. 1, how are you? I am doing well. It has been an interesting day. I've been catching up with work all day, but thankfully I had some time for the stream that we had scheduled tonight. How long have I been streaming, and what made me want to start streaming in general? So I started streaming. When was my first stream? I think it was in July. Yeah, end of July, I think, is when I started streaming. Yeah, and I think that was for the Battle of the Atlantic was that first one. And I had started doing Twitch streaming. I kind of had this notion that I was going to do streaming eventually. There's 2 different stories of that. The first story says I wanted to start streaming because me and my guys from work, which I see that's a question here too, I'll get to that in a moment, but we had thought about doing history podcasts, and we were trying to find a good outlet for it, and I think I'm the only one in the office that had any kind of inkling as to what the hell it was that I would have to end up doing, how to get something off the ground. I think I was also the only one in the office that had any kind of PAO experience outside of unit combatant, this or that. If he ever hears this stream, he's going to kick my ass, but I don't care. I'll defend myself to the death. Poor boss. The other version of the story is that I'm actually a member of a Discord group. A Discord group that has been extremely supportive and interested in certain aspects and things, and I kind of wanted to give back to these guys because they've been helping me keep my sanity. Normally I go to my work office for sanity, but I don't go to my office right now because of COVID. We're in a temporary state of working from home. So I don't have that padding like I used to. So I wanted to give back to this Discord group a little bit. So I started doing these streams. And then the other one, where did I get my interest for history? So there's a few different things that got me interested in history. My interest in history as a general rule is just because history isn't everything. So history is in everything. It touches everything. I think I mentioned that to somebody last night too, in Discord, and I think I mentioned it on my video game stream as well. But it's in everything, and that in of itself makes it very interesting to me, because I can have any kind of interest in any particular object that I want. and I can find history as a common thread between each and every one of those things. So that's why I went for history. Now there's another side of that too, is that once I finally got into history, my first year of undergrad, I had an instructor who actually was on an excavation team with Dr. Michael Coe. And if anybody knows who Dr. Michael Coe is, he is actually the author of the book The Maya and many other Mesoamerican art and architecture research groups. He's also one of the key players that came out with the Maya calendar interpretations in the 1970s and 1980s. And Dr. Coe and my instructor were on a dig at one point in Mesoamerica. And I guess one day, some of the local children did not show up. And what they had found out is that these children had committed suicide. Well, why did they commit suicide? Well, because there was no point in living because of the 2012 prophecy. So it was one of those things where it's just like, wow, bad history can kill. And that's absolutely harrowing and heartbreaking to me. So I kept into history for that reason. But on the other side of it too, my history scope is actually military. So I had decided that I wanted to be in the military somehow, some way. When that didn't happen, I tried to look for another way in, and that way was civilian involvement, which is what I am. I will not mention my employer. I will not mention the who signs my paychecks, but I am a historian, and so it's one of those things where I wear multiple hats, I guess, is what I can best describe as what my occupation is. But historian is the main hat that I wear. So it's rewarding. It's the job that I went to school with the idea to do. So I am extremely lucky in that regards. Not many people get to say that they got the job that they went to school to do. And I love every second of it. I live it. I love my coworkers. My coworkers are great. I love the work environment. The work environment's great. I mean, I couldn't ask for a whole hell of a lot more. So that's awesome to hear that they so were they in World War II? I'm guessing because you mentioned Germany, so I'm guessing they were involved in some shape, way, or form. My claim on World War II actually comes from my grandmother, who was she was a whack, is what they were called, but they also had another name. But they were basically, she was kind of like the Riveters, but she was working mainly in steel plants in Valparaiso, Indiana, and she worked on steel girders that would actually grind metal into reusable pieces. So that's my only claim that I've got to World War II. I've got a claim to World War I, but that's a story for another time. And that gets a little bit more into the weeds than I normally like to get. But as for multiple people podcasting on here, yes and no. This is my stream. This is my username. I go out here. This is the username I use all over the internet. I either run around with the username the kid, the history kid, whatever. That's generally what I run around with. I will occasionally have guests with me. So there is one stream that is coming up where there will actually be some guests that'll be with me. As for the World War II plus 75, that is because we are at World War II plus 75. That is 75-year anniversary. So anytime you see something written like that, that generally means that you are at plus 75 either days, which you normally wouldn't see that. You would probably see World War II plus 3M. for 3 months if that were the case. But in this case, it's World War II plus 75 being 75 years. I see. Ooh, yeah, that I've heard a lot of stories about things like that. Um, there are some crazy stories um, about German on German executions, German firing squads, even family members killing other family members. Um, that is something that's extremely strange, at least to me. I am a child of the '90s, so we didn't really have much of that in the '90s, but um, it, it's a bizarre thought to me, and I would hope it's a bizarre thought to anybody, that kind of violence that our grandparents lived through. It's staggering to me. Um, I actually met with one individual by the name of Henry Langerer, and Mr. Langerer was actually part of the paratrooping team that came in on D-Day. And he's actually, if you ever watch the movie Longest Day, there's a scene where there's a paratrooper that falls through the glass in a greenhouse. And Mr. Langler is actually the person that character is portraying. But he was telling me stories about how he was fleeing from Nazis because he was captured, and then he fled back across from, I guess, East Germany all the way back to Allied lines on the Western Front. And I guess his buddy was executed by Nazis, and he had this pistol, and I guess he bludgeoned these guys to death to escape. I mean, some of the stories you hear are just absolutely gruesome and awful. So, absolutely. Oh wow, Hamburg. Yeah, Hamburg was a rough one. Absolutely. There's I have a presentation out there. I might go back at some point and do some of my older presentations, because these presentations that I've been giving, these plus 75 presentations, these have been presentations that I give at local libraries, and they're retooled for Twitch. But there's one presentation that I give on the combined bombing offensive, and we get into Hamburg just a little bit on that too, and some of the intense combat that actually is involved with Hamburg. So I can imagine. So Dresden is another one that we get in touch with just a little bit too. But yeah, Hamburg. I'm glad to hear though that it's your favorite city though, because Hamburg is fantastic. I think I've once. I don't know. There's occasions where I might end up over at Stuttgart, and if that's the case, I'm gonna have to do my Germany tour to kind of round myself off over there in Germany. But I haven't been myself of late. So, but yeah, well, this is absolutely fantastic. I appreciate it. Um, so let's see here. You come to the U.S., you'll love it. Well, you'll either love it or you won't. Um, afraid of flights, that's okay. I am terrified of water. So flying overseas would be that that's always been a thing for me. It's been just like, well, I'm going to need to make sure that I'm on the inside aisle and I can't see out the window. I need to make sure of that because if I see only water out the window, I'm going to start freaking out. And nobody needs that guy on the plane. Uh, we don't need that. Emergency landings in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or the middle of the Atlantic Ocean because the passenger has gone insane is not my idea of a good time. So, and especially in the Atlantic, because where are you going to land? Greenland? Oh, that sounds fun. We'll land at Thule. Huh, that'll be great. So, but anyway, I am actually going to wrap up for the evening here. I think everybody that came out here, um, this is not this is not the fixed schedule right now as I have it. Um, I mean, everything on here is going to happen on the day that it's on here, but I now will have the October schedule up probably like right when I end this stream. So the next stream is going to be on a weapons system called the Triple Threat Weapon and the Atomic Cannon. We affectionately refer to her as Annie. She is a lady and she demands respect, but most people don't know about Annie. However, you might actually be interested in that simply because Annie, her origins come from Germany, 1942, if memory serves me right, Anzio Annie. And that's actually where that presentation will start, is in Germany, 1942. And it'll be going up through about August of 1970. So this will begin one of what we call the Forgotten History series. We'll be talking primarily about things in the atomic age, the atomic era, the Cold War, and specific weapon systems that we had going on through this period of time. So 10 September, 1800 hours, so about this time. That's when we'll be doing that presentation. 24 September, we'll be looking at the atomic age, the evolution of nuclear deterrence in the Cold War. So we're going to be briefly touching on things like that tactical nuclear weapons deployment. We'll be looking at nuclear deterrence and the birth of the nuclear triad. So if anybody's not familiar with the term nuclear triad today, the nuclear triad consists of ICBMs, nuclear submarines, and strategic bombers. That is the incarnation of the nuclear triad today, but it didn't mean the same thing yesterday as it did today. So we'll be looking at some of the origins of that. And again, all of those are going to be on VOD. A little bit, it's not on this one, but I'm going to point it out anyway. In October, we'll be doing 2 presentations, as I mentioned. The first presentation is going to be on, both of them are going to be haunted history. The first one is going to be on Quarters 1 at Rock Island Arsenal, and some of the spooky tales that go on with Quarters 1. Especially from the fact that apparently it's like the most haunted place in the state of Illinois, apparently. I've been told by some less than reputable sources, but okay. And then we're also going to be going on a trip down memory lane. Oh my god, this still creeps me out. We're going to be dealing with Dyatov Pass, the incident at Dyatov Pass, which creeps me out still. And in the midst of all that, on Saturdays, we will be doing creepy no sleep readings from Reddit. Those will be on Saturdays in October. And then, of course, the random video game streams that I'm throwing in there. So we have Tales of Berseria stuff for the Alter site. That will be coming back up again on 30 August at 8 o'clock. And then we'll be, I can't believe this already, we're wrapping up Spyro, I think, like next Tuesday. It went a little bit faster than I thought it was going to. But let's see. I try and I don't think there's been a history stream or a video game stream yet where I haven't done history something or other. Even if it's something ridiculously dumb, like I think my last Tales of Berseria stream, I randomly started talking about one-hit wonders from the 1970s. I mean, I'll talk about history anytime you want. I mean, you can always poke me with a history topic. I'm probably going to talk to you about it. So, I mean, if you see a video game stream on this channel, it's going to be me that's playing it. Jump in and talk some history stuff. Go for it. Absolutely, absolutely. And don't worry about the questions. It's fine. Great grandfather, a soldier in World War One. My great grandfather on my dad's side was a sentry during World War One. That's a story. I won't go into that right now, but that's a story. But well, this has been absolutely fantastic. Normally, I would stick around a little bit longer and answer those questions, but unfortunately, tonight I actually have two conference calls that I still got to take care of, and I've got a bunch of emails that are growing in my inbox and an SOP to take care of. As always, though, feel free. You can reach out to me on Twitch. You can also reach out to me on the website, which is over there. And if all of those fail, you can always catch the next stream. As I said, 30 August. That is Sunday, and we will be streaming at 8 o'clock, so we'll actually be starting at about this time on Sunday. So, fantastic. We'll see you folks around. Thanks for coming tonight, folks. Have a good one.